5 November 1991. The Lady Ghislaine drifts off the Canary Islands. The body of its owner is recovered from the Atlantic. In 4 weeks, auditors will count what he took. £460 million from his own employees' pensions. Jan Ludvik Hoch was born on the 10th of June 1923 in a village called Slatinska Doli, on a map drawn by Czechoslovakia at the time, a map redrawn many times since. He grew up Yiddish-speaking, Orthodox, the third of 7 children. By 1944, most of those children, and both of their parents, had been deported to Auschwitz. Only Jan and 2 sisters survived. He fought. He joined the Czechoslovak army in exile. In January of 1945, he stormed a German machine gun nest in northern Europe. Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery pinned the military cross to his uniform. By June of 1946, he was a British subject. By June of 1948, his name was Ian Robert Maxwell. The change was formal, by deed, filed properly. The empire he would build was, in a sense, also formal, filed properly, documented carefully, visible from the start to anyone who chose to look. Pergamon Press, an academic publisher, came first, then Westminster. Maxwell sat as Labour Member of Parliament for the constituency of Buckingham from 1964 to 1970. The seat was his. Then it wasn't. Then he turned back to business. And the business he chose was paper. Newspapers. The British Printing Corporation, the Mirror Group newspapers, bought from Reed International in July of 1984 for £113 million. In 1987, the British Printing Corporation took his name, Maxwell Communication Corporation. By 1991, his private companies carried bank borrowings of approximately £1 billion. That figure mattered. The figure had been growing quietly, year after year. The figure had a structure underneath it, a structure that involved other people's retirement money. It is worth pausing on what is meant by other people's retirement money. At this point, Robert Maxwell controlled 7 pension funds. The largest belonged to the Mirror Group, roughly 16,000 British workers, their dependents, and the deferred retirements of decades of journalists, printers, drivers, secretaries. In 1985, the year after he bought the Mirror Group, the pension fund began lending money to the private side of his empire. The pattern would deepen for 6 years. No one in Westminster, no auditor, no trustee called it out in public. The architecture was, again, formal, documented, filed properly. In 1988, the biographer Tom Bower published Maxwell, The Outsider. The book sold in Britain. Maxwell sued. He sued repeatedly. The book did not appear in the United States, not while its subject was alive. Worth noting, there were rumors about other things too, about espionage, about Mossad. Seymour Hersh, in The Samson Option, would write about an Israeli connection. The evidence remained thin. The rumors did not. The biographer waited. Empire, by 1990, was almost intact. A man who had survived a continent's destruction. A man who had pinned the military cross. A man who had bought British newspapers from a position no one in his birth village could have imagined. It would take, in the end, less than 2 years to undo all of it. Bishopsgate Investment Management Limited. The name reads as a piece of city furniture. The address, Bishopsgate, in the heart of the financial district. The company was registered in England. It was regulated by the Investment Management Regulatory Organization under the Financial Services Act of 1986. The proper authority. The proper law. From March of 1988, Bishopsgate Investment Management held the Common Investment Fund, pension assets of the Mirror Group, pension assets of related companies, several schemes, pooled, professionally managed. And from February of 1988 onwards, Robert Maxwell was a director of Bishopsgate Investment Management. So were his sons, Kevin and Ian. From September of 1991, Larry Trachtenberg, his close advisor, joined the board. The pensions were not in some Caribbean trust. The pensions were inside the City of London, regulated, registered, professionally administered, by a board the Maxwells controlled. What is less often mentioned, this is the architecture the Department of Trade and Industry would later examine. For 9 years, across more than 700 pages, at a cost to the British state of £10 million. Their report was published on the 29th of March 2001. The findings were these. Pension assets were used on a regular basis to make unsecured loans to the private side of Maxwell's empire. Pension assets were used to buy back Mirror Group shares, sometimes through other people. Pension assets were posted as collateral for further bank borrowing. The borrowing supported what the borrowing failed to repay. In 1991, the Mirror Group itself was floated on the public market. 49% of the shares were sold to British investors. £235 million was raised. Of that £235 million, not £1 entered the pension fund. The Department of Trade and Industry would later describe the flotation prospectus as, and the phrase is exact, materially inaccurate and misleading. There is one player in this story whose role is rarely emphasized: Goldman Sachs, the American investment bank. By 1991, Goldman had extended approximately $60 million in credit to Robert Maxwell. That, on its own, would not have been unusual. What was unusual was the options. Goldman Sachs bought options on millions of Maxwell Communication Corporation shares. Then it sold them back to Maxwell. The mechanism allowed Maxwell to accumulate shares in his own company during periods when the law prohibited him from doing so directly. British securities regulators would later examine these transactions. The Department of Trade and Industry report, in its final findings, would attribute substantial responsibility to Goldman Sachs for the manipulation of the share price. By the autumn of 1991, the structure was finished. The pensions had been pledged, the shares had been bought, the flotation had been completed. The bank borrowings of the private side stood at approximately £1 billion. What happened next had been arranged for years. Worth saying plainly. Most of this was on the record, filed at Companies House, reported in the financial press of the time, discussed, briefly, on the floor of the House of Commons. Few read it. Few connected the filings to the funeral that was about to be arranged. The 5th of November, 1991. The Lady Ghislaine off the Canary Islands. The body recovered from the Atlantic. 68 years old, unclothed, no clear signs of violence. The body was taken to a forensic institute in Las Palmas. 3 pathologists were involved in the autopsy. 3 pathologists could not agree on what had happened. On the 14th of December, 1991, the coroner, Judge Isabel Oliva, recorded heart failure, an additional causative factor not specified, and accidental drowning. That formulation has never been improved upon. Forensic pathologists do not write additional causative factor to be poetic. It is the language of doubt. Theories remained. Heart attack on deck and a fall into the sea. Suicide. Foul play. None of the 3 was confirmed. None of the 3 was eliminated. In London, the banks began to call in their loans. The auditors discovered something that should have been impossible to miss. The pension funds were empty. Or rather, their assets were now spread across the private companies of Robert Maxwell. Approximately £460 million were missing. In today's money, more than £1.2 billion. On the 12th of December, 1991, 5 weeks after the death, the House of Commons held a debate on pension funds. Kenneth Hind, member for Lancashire West, opened it. The inspector's report on Maxwell was quoted on the floor of the House. The phrase used was, "This man should never be allowed to control a public company." Of trust law, the phrase used by another member was, "A coach and horses was driven through that law." Of what had been done to the funds, robbing them blind. 16,000 Mirror Group pensioners. Across the 7 funds, several thousand more. Workers who had paid in, workers who had retired, workers who had buried colleagues. The pension contributions they had made for years had been used to keep Robert Maxwell's private empire borrowing. Their retirement had been collateral for someone else's debt. In 1992, Kevin Maxwell, second son, would be declared the largest personal bankrupt in the history of the United Kingdom. Personal debts of £406.5 million. In 1995, an arbiter named Sir John Cuckney would broker a settlement. £276 million from the banks and the auditors who had handled the accounts, plus £100 million, effectively, from the British state, in the form of deferred premiums on the state scheme. The contributor of last resort, in part, was the British taxpayer. In January of 1996, Kevin and Ian Maxwell and Larry Trachtenberg stood trial at the Old Bailey. 8 months, a serious fraud office prosecution. All 3 were acquitted. The criminal verdict was clear. The civil and regulatory findings, when the Department of Trade and Industry finally reported in 2001, were less so. What is established? A British family, regulated by British authority, used the retirement money of British workers as a credit line for the private companies of a man who would not live to face questions. The mechanism was within the city. The mechanism was on the record. 3 pathologists could not agree on what killed Robert Maxwell. The Old Bailey acquitted his sons of the criminal charges. The Department of Trade and Industry, 10 years after his death, attributed responsibility to many people, locked no one up. What endures is not the verdict. What endures is the technique. The pensions of others treated as private liquidity. After Maxwell, Parliament passed the Pensions Act of 1995. The Act tightened the rules. It did not abolish the model. The model still works. Anywhere the trustees are connected, by family, by board, by interest, to the borrower. History remembered the headline. It forgot the paperwork. Read the footnote.